So now that we've gone through all the major structures in turn, let me summarize what we've learned about the information architecture of the brain and indicate where we go from here. At the highest level, we've got this overall brain architecture. And we reached a critical conclusion that we've got these two information models, condition definition detection and behavior recommendation, that are embedded in the brain at all levels, except in the case of the cerebellum, where the almost complete absence of learning means that instructions can be used much like in electronic systems. The existence of these models means, for example, we can identify condition, define and detect processes at different anatomical levels in the cortex, with higher level condition, define, detect processes being combinations of condition, define, detect processes at more detailed levels, from cortical column to the chemistry within one neuron. And the same is true of behavioral recommendation processes, where at the higher levels the behaviors are of three types. One type is release of cortical condition detection information to different targets. And those targets can include release of sensory information into the cortex, releases between cortical areas, and releases out of the cortex to drive muscles. And at more detailed levels, an information release behavior is the release of a specific combination of neuron receptive field detections, and at an even more detailed level, a release behavior is implemented by placing a frequency modulation on the outputs of specific neurons. A second general type of behavior recommendation is in favor of changes to receptive fields and conditions, again on different levels of detail, from expanding receptive fields across an area to changing the weight of a synapse, or even more detailed chemical levels. And the third type is changes to the recommendation weights in favor of behaviors. And again, we can describe the processes on different levels in the same information terms. So the implication is that if we describe high-level cognitive processes in condition detection and behavior recommendation terms, we can map our descriptions to anatomy, then to physiology, and all the way down to chemistry. And in the rest of this course, we're going to be doing that. Although in practice, once we know that the map down to detailed levels exists, most of the time we only need to consider descriptions at the higher levels. We've covered the information processes performed by all these structures. The most complex information processing is performed by the cortex, but all the information generated by the cortex is behaviorally ambiguous. Cortical outputs are only recommendations, and the other structures are needed to interpret the results of cortical processing into behaviors. So, before getting to higher cognition, let me briefly remind you of the key aspects of information processes in the various structures. The cortex is organized into different areas that detect receptive fields in different ranges of complexity. Each range of complexity has been defined genetically. Natural selection has identified ranges of complexity that are particularly effective for discriminating between circumstances in which all the different types of behavior needed by the brain are appropriate. The individual receptive fields are defined within the range of complexity from an area from experience. And discrimination means that recommendation weights in favor of different behaviors can be assigned in a way that ensures high integrity behavior selections at every point in time. But this means that the recommendation weights associated with a receptive field can only be accessed if the receptive field is detected. Often, that's by direct detection of the receptive field in the current sensory inputs. And of course, the recommendation weights can be made available for a little longer by prolonging the activity that indicated detection. But as we discussed earlier, if an undetected receptive field was recently detected at the same time as some currently detected fields, its recommendations may be relevant. But to get at those recommendations, it has to be activated. But in this case, indirectly, rather than by current sensory inputs. Similarly, if an inactive receptive field was often active in the past at the same time as currently active fields, its recommendation weights may be relevant. Or if it expanded at the same time in the past as currently active fields. And of course, past temporally correlated activity that was not exactly at the same time may also be a good indicator. And there's always the proviso that activation of all the receptive fields that had any or correlation with the currently active receptive fields would result in chaos. So indirect activations must be behaviors that are recommended and accepted or rejected just like any other behaviors. And as we touched on earlier, these acceptances and rejections of indirect activation behaviors will be implemented by the basal ganglia and thalamus releasing cortical information between different areas. At a much more detailed level of description, indirect activation means that neurons must be activated even if their primary receptive field isn't present. So they have to develop secondary receptive fields that record the conditions indicating that indirect activation is appropriate. And because the neuron could be activated in inappropriate circumstances if inputs to the direct receptive field were mixed with inputs to the indirect receptive field, the two sets of inputs must be separated, for example on apical and basal dendrites. The hippocampal system detects receptive fields corresponding with groups of cortical columns that expanded their receptive fields at similar times in the past, then uses these receptive fields primarily to guide future receptive field expansions, but also, secondarily, to guide indirect activations on the basis of past simultaneous receptive field expansion. At a more detailed level, the column is the primary functional unit for determining when and where cortical receptive field expansions occur. And the expansions are implemented at the neuron, terminal dendritic branch and synapse levels by the mechanisms we talked about. Within the hippocampal system, there's this competition process at each point in time to determine which receptive fields will expand. And the expansion process is achieved by combinations of processes performed by various cortical areas, the hippocampus proper, and various subcortical structures, all contributing the type of information process in which they specialize. So it's still cortical information that's determining which receptive fields will expand. But to interpret that cortical information requires all sorts of structures outside the cortex, the hippocampus proper, the thalamus, the amygdala, the basal forebrain, and so on. We talked about how the thalamus manages information flows using a frequency modulation mechanism. The basal ganglia selects the most appropriate current information flows by interpreting cortical outputs as recommendation weights in favor of different flows, and selecting and implementing the flow with the largest total recommendation weight. Recommendation weight changes are managed a little differently. These reward behaviors are recommended by cortical receptive field detections, but they're implemented back into the basal ganglia through the midbrain dopamine neurons. And there's that spiral of connectivity that manages strategic, tactical, and more detailed rewards, and especially the interactions between them. Then sometimes different types of behaviors can be selected at the same time. You can walk, look around, and think in various ways all at the same time. So there are parallel paths from the cortex to the basal ganglia, onto the thalamus, and back to the cortex that manage selection of motor behaviors, attention behaviors, and various cognitive behaviors with rather less cross-inhibition. I also touched on how the hypothalamus and amygdala manage the relative priorities placed on different general types of behaviour, again by acting back onto the cortex. And then there are also some nuclei that distribute specific neurotransmitters very widely across the brain. And these also use cortical information to manage the general arousal state of the cortex, and also the arousal of other brain structures. And finally, as we discussed earlier, the cerebellum records frequently used sequences of actions after they've been learned, and executes such sequences rapidly and reproducibly when required. Once more, based on cortical information, but in this case, because learning has been completed, converting the cortical information into behavioral commands. And we talked about the more detailed level microzones in the cerebellum recording the different individual sequences. So now we've got to the stage where we're going to use all the architectural considerations we've developed to understand cognition. What that means is we want to relate cognitive phenomena like attention, different types of memory, speech, consciousness, and specific cognitive problem solving to the functions being performed by anatomical structures on lots of different levels of detail, from major structures like the cortex, hippocampus, thalamus, through substructures like cortical areas and columns, neurons, dendrites, synapses, down to the underlying neurochemistry. In other words, take any cognitive task, even very specific tasks, and describe how that task is performed in terms of more detailed anatomical and physiological processes. Remember, the problem we have to solve is that we may be able to describe what's going on in a synapse, for example, to some degree of accuracy. But in a typical millisecond period, across the brain about 1 million synapses are getting input action potentials. And we don't have the ability to think about all those synapses at the same time. We have to thin down the information content, but in a way that maintains the integrity of the thinned down higher level descriptions. In the case of electronic systems, we use the ubiquitous presence of instruction and data information processes to map from the operations of individual transistors to descriptions of system features that employ billions of transistors. And we've established that we can view almost any information process performed by the brain on any level of detail as being one of two general types, either a behavioral recommendation process or a condition definition detection process. And that gives us a bridge to map between high-level and detailed descriptions of the brain. If we can describe a higher cognitive process in terms of these types of information processes, it provides a way to move to the more detailed descriptions of parts of the higher level process using the same types of information processes. So now what we're going to do is go through a number of different higher level cognitive processes and see how we can apply these information paradigms to understanding the cognitive processing in terms of anatomy and physiology.